James Comer was leaning forward, eyes wide, finger jabbing toward his colleague. His voice, rough with rage, echoed longer than it should have. Across the table, Repress Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply paused, one hand resting on her notes, the other calmly adjusting her mic, as if brushing away the noise with grace. The silence was almost louder than the shout. And then it happened on screens, in tweets, in stitched TikToks and stitched-together headlines. The moment exploded online like a match to dry grass. Comer loses it on Crockett. Stop talking? In Congress? Jasmine Crockett stays calm, collected, and correct. In living rooms across the country, jaws dropped again as the clip played on loop. Some shook their heads. Others whispered, "He really said that?" But for millions, especially those long told to lower their voice, dim their light, or sit down when they spoke up, this moment was more than political theater. It was personal. Crockett's stillness became a symbol, her silence louder than Comer's scream. Because in that single instant, everything shifted. The man who shouted looked small. The woman who waited looked powerful, and the people watching knew. Something deeper had just cracked open. This wasn't just about decorum. This wasn't just about disagreement. It was about power, identity, and the kind of dignity that doesn't need to raise its voice to shake the ground. But, while the moment itself felt sudden like lightning, out of a clear sky the storm had been building, long before the cameras caught fire. The tension, the hypocrisy, the rising desperation, it had all been simmering below the surface. And as the dust settled from Comer's eruption, one question remained, rising like smoke across every screen in America. What made him snap? Because the answer to that question would reveal far more than anyone was ready for. The Oversight Committee room was tense from the start. Cameras flashed. Aides shifted in their seats. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a quiet hearing. Too many headlines had already built to this moment accusations of corruption, alleged misuse of power, shadowy financials, and the same tired faces acting like none of it mattered. Chairman James Comer presided at the center, like a man both in control and under siege. His allies flanked him, papers in hand, outrage loaded and ready. Across the aisle sat the Democrats, wearied but unshaken. Among them, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, freshman, firebrand, and former public defender, flipped quietly through a thick binder of documents. What brought them all here? A scandal, one that could have belonged to either party, but this time, the spotlight tilted uncomfortably toward Comer himself. Reports had surfaced suggesting suspicious financial dealings, family entanglements, and opaque funding structures. Instead of answers, Comer launched a counterattack. Subpoenas flew in all directions, but always away from himself. The hearing's official topic? Restoring public trust. But everyone watching knew what it really was. A deflection campaign dressed up as an accountability crusade. Comer pounded his opening statement with righteous fury. "The American people are tired of the lies," he declared, voice quaking just enough to read as passion or panic. "We're going to expose corruption wherever it hides." But the questions from his side of the aisle were softballs, designed for headlines, not truth. When Democrats tried to dig deeper to turn the questions back toward Comer's own ethical entanglements, they were met with procedural objections, interruptions, and thinly veiled contempt. And that's when Crockett leaned in. Her binder hit the desk with a soft thud. Her tone was calm, her words precise. She began asking the questions no one else had dared say out loud about Comer's alleged financial entanglements, about a suspicious $200,000 payment involving his brother, and about whether this very hearing was just a distraction from his own misconduct. Across the dais, faces stiffened. Comer stared, lips tight, eyes narrowing with every sentence. Because this wasn't just a colleague asking questions. It was a black woman in full command of her facts, daring to interrupt the power narrative he thought he controlled. And outside that hearing room, Americans were watching with growing exhaustion, tired of political theater, of men in suits shouting about truth while dodging it at every turn. They wanted someone, anyone who would speak plainly, who would stop pretending that outrage equals innocence. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard, and that's when it happened. Her question cut just a little too close. Her facts too specific. Her tone too steady. The calm was louder than any accusation. Comer exploded. "Stop talking!" It wasn't strategy. It wasn't political theater. It was a raw, unfiltered reaction, the kind that reveals what someone really fears: losing control of the story. But what he didn't realize in that moment was this: Crockett wasn't done. Because tucked in her binder was something no amount of shouting could silence: evidence, facts, receipts. And the minute she opened it again, the hearing would turn from scandal into reckoning. Long before James Comer screamed across the Oversight Committee room, his pattern was already well established. To his supporters, he's a bulldog, relentless, unafraid, a Southern-twanged warrior for truth. But to many others watching from across the aisle and across the country, he's something else entirely: the face of a political era defined by selective outrage and weaponized deflection. Comer built his brand not on quiet diligence or bipartisan integrity, but on televised theater, and it worked for a while. Each hearing became a stage, each microphone a weapon. His lines were always the same: "We demand transparency. The American people deserve answers. This is about restoring trust." But trust, it turns out, doesn't survive on slogans alone. Beneath the fury lay contradictions. He railed against government nepotism while his own family business received questionable payments. He accused opponents of hiding finances while refusing to release his own full disclosures. When confronted, he didn't clarify. He deflected, dodged, or if pressed too far, erupted. This wasn't new behavior. In fact, a pattern had emerged. Rewind the tapes. At a previous hearing, Comer lost his temper when Representative Jamie Raskin calmly questioned the selective nature of his subpoenas. "You're obsessed with deflecting," Comer barked. Raskin responded with a smirk and another citation. Comer's face reddened. At a press conference last year, when a journalist pressed him about a potential conflict of interest involving a land deal, Comer walked away from the podium muttering, "This is ridiculous," rather than answer. And in private interviews, his tone often shifted: less fire, more evasion. "That's not what we're here to discuss." "I haven't seen that report." "The American people don't care about that." But they did care. Because what they were seeing wasn't a principled truth-teller, it was someone picking and choosing outrage the way a stage director picks lighting. Scandals were spotlighted only when convenient. Questions were welcome until they pointed in his direction. Still, Comer pressed forward. His committee issued dozens of subpoenas, held dozens of hearings. But when asked to investigate corruption within his own party or his own name, suddenly the air got thin and the talking points ran dry. And yet for months he'd gotten away with it. The media cycles were fast. The outrage was louder than the facts. And for every evasive answer, there was a sympathetic headline or a pundit ready to applaud his tough stance. Then came the ethics questions. A $200,000 payment. A family connection. A web of financial entanglements that looked eerily similar to the very behavior he condemned in others. Suddenly, Comer's armor started to crack, but he still had one strategy left: volume. When challenged, he'd raise his voice, talk over the question, accuse the accuser. It worked on cable news. It worked in committee rooms where challengers stayed polite. It worked because, for the most part, no one had dared match his fire with calm conviction. Until Jasmine Crockett. The moment she opened her mouth, the temperature in the room changed. She didn't interrupt. She didn't shout. She didn't roll her eyes or storm out. She simply began to ask the kind of questions that didn't need performance to land, because they came wrapped in documented truth. Comer could have ignored it, could have answered with facts, but he didn't, because something about her poise, her precision, her refusal to be rattled pierced through his practiced armor. He saw the danger, and in his world, danger must be silenced. Stop talking. But what Comer didn't realize, what he still doesn't, is that people like Jasmine Crockett don't need to raise their voice to be heard, because when you're armed with truth, composure is louder than shouting. And this time, the person sitting across from him wasn't just another Democrat. She was a storm wrapped in calm. Long before she was sitting in a marble-walled committee room, facing down one of the loudest voices in Washington, Jasmine Crockett was already in the fight. She wasn't born into politics. She earned her way in. Raised in St. Louis, she learned early what it meant to speak up when the room didn't want to listen. She didn't come from a dynasty. She didn't inherit a platform. What she did have was fire, not the kind that burns recklessly, but the kind that sustains. Slow, focused, undeniable. Crockett went to law school not to climb ladders, but to defend those at the bottom. She became a public defender in Texas, one of the toughest, most thankless jobs in the system, and made it her mission to fight for people the world wanted to forget. Young black men railroaded through courtrooms, mothers forced to choose between silence and survival. She sat beside them, argued for them, stood up when no one else would. In a courtroom, she learned what pressure feels like, and how to stay still inside the storm. She also learned that truth doesn't always speak loudest, but it always lasts longest. When she ran for state office, she didn't do it for optics. She ran because she was tired of watching her community be talked about, but never to. Her campaign was grassroots, underfunded, underestimated. But she walked the streets, knocked doors, showed up in church basements and school gymnasiums, and people listened because she sounded like them. Not polished, not rehearsed, just real. When she got to Austin, they called her too bold. When she called out injustice on the House floor, they said she was aggressive. When she refused to water down her words, they branded her difficult. She wore it all like armor. And when she ran for Congress, they told her it was too soon. They were wrong. Now in Washington, she's one of the most closely watched new voices on Capitol Hill. Not because she's chasing cameras, but because she brings receipts. Always. When others posture, she prepares. When others perform, she prosecutes, and America is noticing. Her viral moments aren't gaffes. They're gospel. There was the hearing where she calmly dismantled GOP talking points on race and policing, quoting data while her opponents sputtered. There was the moment she turned a veiled insult into a rallying cry. "You don't get to define my tone when you ignore my truth." And there was the now legendary clip where she cut through a filibuster with a single line. "I'm not here for theatrics. I'm here for justice." Each time she didn't shout. She didn't need to. She spoke like someone who had stood in front of judges, juries, and power brokers, and never lost herself. Online, the reaction was immediate. TikTok dubbed her the unbothered queen. Edits circulated with her calmest moments overlaid with gospel chords, orchestral drops and captions like, "When you've got the truth and the receipts." Black Twitter lit up. "She's our Maxine, our Shirley, our Michelle, and she's just getting started." One tweet racked up 1 million likes. "This ain't performative. This is generational. She carries us when she speaks." Gen Z stitched her into everything. React videos, duets, edits that turned her pauses into punchlines. But they weren't mocking her. They were marveling, admiring, aspiring. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just represent a district. She represented a feeling of finally being seen, heard, and respected. In a Congress where power often looks like ego, she brought a different kind of power, one rooted in precision, poise, and principle. She didn't need to dominate the room. She commanded it. And that's what made her so dangerous, not just to James Comer, but to the entire ecosystem of men who were used to hearing their own voices echo back unchallenged. He wasn't there to play the game. She was there to change it. And the binder she brought to that oversight hearing, it wasn't a prop. It was her playbook. Dates, quotes, financial trails, legal language, evidence that couldn't be denied no matter how loudly someone yelled. She flipped the page, spoke clearly, dismantled a narrative. And when Comer lost his composure, she didn't even raise an eyebrow. because to her it wasn't personal. It was expected. She'd seen it in courtrooms. She'd seen it in legislatures. She'd seen it her whole life. Power threatened by truth lashes out. But truth, when spoken with calm conviction, becomes armor. Jasmine Crockett wore that armor with pride. And on that day, she came armed with facts and a fearless sense of purpose. The hearing room buzzed under fluorescent lights, the kind of quiet tension that hums before a storm. Chairs creaked, papers rustled. Testimony blurred into noise until Jasmine Crockett spoke again. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice low but firm, "can you clarify why this committee has issued over a dozen subpoenas, but none that address your own financial records?" A subtle pause. Then a sharp inhale from Comer. "That's not relevant," he said, tight-lipped. Crockett tilted her head slightly. "So financial transparency is only required of others?" "I said it's not relevant." Her eyes didn't move from his. She flipped a page in her binder. "Well, I have here—" "You're out of line," Comer cut in. She blinked. "I haven't finished my question." The room tensed. Aides leaned forward. Cameras adjusted. The rhythm shifted. "Let her finish," a voice muttered from behind her mic. Comer's hand slapped the table. Not hard, but loud enough to pull heads toward him. "She is wasting time with partisan nonsense." Crockett didn't even look up from her notes. "If facts are partisan, I think we've found the real problem." A muffled chuckle somewhere in the chamber. Comer's jaw locked. His voice climbed. "You don't get to come in here and make baseless accusations." "They're not baseless," Crockett interrupted, still calm. "They're itemized." Comer rose halfway from his chair. "This is not a courtroom." Crockett didn't flinch. "That's true, because in a courtroom, you'd have to answer under oath." The words hung like smoke. A beat. Comer turned to the chair beside him, whispering something sharp. His colleague looked away, uncomfortable. Crockett, meanwhile, adjusted her glasses and calmly turned another page. "I'm simply asking," she continued, "why this committee continues to ignore clear ethical red flags." "Enough!" Comer's voice cracked. "I'm telling you, stop pushing this narrative." "Mr. Chairman," she said evenly, "the only thing being pushed is the truth. Stop talking." The shout echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Gasps rippled across the room. The sound technician flinched. One aide dropped his pen. For a half-second, the entire room was frozen, as if reality itself needed time to process the moment. Crockett looked up, slowly. Her face said everything. His didn't. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. She was ready. The power dynamic flipped right there, in real time. He had the gavel, but she held the ground. And everyone in the room felt it. Comer sat back down, breathing heavy. Face flushed. Knuckles tight against the desk. Crockett closed her binder, not slamming it. Not performing, just closing it. Because she knew what was coming next. And so did he. Then in a flash of anger he snapped, "Stop talking!" The shout rang out again, louder this time, as if sheer volume could rewrite the rules of the hearing. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't so much as blink. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of her binder. Her expression, unreadable but unwavering, held the room in a quiet, defiant spell. It was the silence that made it powerful. One beat, two, a third. Then, without flinching, she leaned forward. Her fingers tapped the base of the microphone once. It clicked to life. "Mr. Chairman," she began, voice low and clear, "I understand that things may be getting uncomfortable for you, but I have the floor. No raised tone, no snark, just control like a metronome ticking steady while everything else spun out." Comer tried to interject, but she kept speaking not louder, just more precisely. "You've accused this committee of seeking truth. So let's deal in it." She opened her binder with a soft thud. The pages flicked until she landed on the document. Page 17. A copy of the wire transfer from your brother's account. $200,000 dated exactly 1 week after a grant was awarded to a company you're linked to. Gasps. Audible ones. Real, across the dais. One Republican staffer leaned toward another and whispered something tight-lipped. Comer's eyes darted to the paper, then to Crockett, then back again. She didn't stop. "I'm not speculating. I'm quoting numbers. Your numbers." Her eyes stayed locked on his. "You said earlier that the American people deserve transparency." "I agree. So please explain what transparency looks like when you've refused to testify about your own financial entanglements." He tried again. "That's a mischaracterization." But she held up a hand, not forcefully, just confidently, like a lawyer telling the court, "You'll get your turn, but not yet." "Let me educate you, sir," she said. And that was the line. The moment everything tilted, because it wasn't a clapback. It wasn't a zinger. It was instruction delivered like a professor, correcting a student who hadn't done his reading. "You've accused others of wrongdoing without evidence," she continued. "I'm presenting evidence and simply asking you to respond. But instead of answering, you've attempted to shout me down." The murmur in the room grew, chairs shifting, papers rustling, a collective unease among Comer's allies. On the Democratic side, heads nodded. One representative smirked. Another whispered, "She's cooking." Online, it was already happening. A viral clip from the hearing trimmed down to 15 seconds hit Twitter, Justice Watchdog. Crockett, calm. Comer, cooked. Gen Z politics. "Let me educate you, sir." And she did. Legal TikTok. She just brought evidence to a shouting match. The moment began to fracture into reaction content before it had even finished live. Stitch after stitch. Me when someone tries to lie with no receipts. Comer found out what a binder full of facts feels like. But back in the room, Crockett hadn't looked away. "In court, sir, we call this cross-examination. It's where the facts don't bend for political convenience." She flipped another page. "This is a copy of your 2021 disclosure form. Note the missing financial ties, which were later corrected, only after investigative reporting revealed them." Comer tried to wave it off. "Old news," he muttered. She raised an eyebrow. "Ethics don't expire." "Mr. Chairman." Comer shifted in his seat, glancing toward the ranking member, as if to signal a need for backup. But no one jumped in, because in that moment, even his allies knew the narrative had slipped. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her, and she wasn't done. "There is a pattern here," she said calmly. "A pattern of misdirection, of selective outrage, and when pressed of hostility." Another line that would echo across social platforms within minutes. "I didn't raise my voice, sir." "You did." "I didn't make assumptions." "I cited documents." "I didn't call names." "I asked questions." Her hands folded on the table. Her voice softened. "And if that's threatening to you, maybe that says more about your position than mine." Silence. No interruptions. No rebuttal. Just a stunned room and a chairman stripped of the protection his volume once offered. Then a quiet clap from the audience section. Just one, then another, until it was silenced by the gavel, but not before the message was clear. The hearing may have resumed. The minutes may have ticked forward, but the story had already been written. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the outburst. She rewrote the scene. In real time. In real power. And by the end of it, James Comer wasn't shouting anymore, because the one thing louder than his voice was the truth she laid bare. What happened after the hearing was even louder than what happened inside. By the time the committee hearing recessed, the internet had already erupted. Within minutes, the clip of James Comer shouting, "Stop talking!" while Jasmine Crockett sat still, blinking slowly behind her binder, was everywhere. It wasn't just trending, it was the trend. Crockett vs. Comer. Stop talking. Calm clap back 3 hashtags. One cultural moment. Twitter timelines flooded with side-by-side stills. Comer mid-scream, Crockett mid-glare. TikTok exploded with remixes. Courtroom music, gospel harmonies, even ASMR edits of Crockett, calmly flipping her binder pages. Influencers reenacted the moment with comedic flair, but always with the same punchline: she didn't have to yell. She just showed up ready. Gens for Justice. When they shout, but you've got the receipts. Legal Eagle YT. Masterclass. Absolute masterclass. Every law student should study that hearing. Culture commentary. Comer thought volume equals victory. Crockett proved clarity is louder. Celebrities jumped in. Ava DuVernay tweeted a still of Crockett with the caption, "Grace under fire." Let's talk about it. Kerry Washington. Unbothered, unbossed, unmatched. Even sports figures weighed in. LeBron James posted the clip on Instagram stories with a fire emoji, and she cooked him without breaking a sweat. Meanwhile, the news network scrambled to catch up. MSNBC dubbed it an explosive turning point in the oversight drama. CNN ran a segment titled, "From Silence to Symbol: Why Crockett's Calm Hit So Hard." Fox News, visibly rattled, framed it as a Democrat ambush, insisting Comer was understandably frustrated. The right stumbled through talking points. One commentator called her rude. Another accused her of grandstanding. But their sound bites couldn't compete with the visual. A man yelling, a woman waiting. The contrast was too stark, too real. Inside Congress, the reactions were just as telling. Democratic colleagues whispered words like iconic and legend in hallway debriefs. Some sent private messages of admiration. Others said what many felt, that Crockett had just shifted the power dynamic in real time. Republican lawmakers, on the other hand, were quieter. Some avoided reporters. Others deflected questions. A few issued careful statements about passion in high-stakes settings. But even they knew this wasn't a good look. The meme machine, meanwhile, was in overdrive. Photoshopped boxing posters. The binder versus the bluster. Crockett edited into Marvel scenes, deflecting Comer's shout like Captain America catching a punch. One viral tweet showed Crockett calmly sipping tea with the caption, "When you've already won the argument before it starts." And then there were the TikTok's teens and college students syncing her exact movements to trending audio. "Let me educate you, sir. Pause. Ethics don't expire." The comment sections turned into digital standing ovations. People shared personal stories of being talked over, of being dismissed, of being underestimated. Crockett's moment had become theirs. "I watched this 5 times today. I needed it. I showed this to my daughter. Told her, this is how you stand tall without raising your voice. This is what representation looks like." And beyond the virality, there was a deeper current, an emotional one. People weren't just entertained. They were affirmed, because for every person who'd ever been told to calm down when they were already calm, for every woman who'd ever been shouted over in a meeting, for every black professional who'd ever been labeled aggressive for speaking plainly, Jasmine Crockett's silence was thunder. She didn't need to trend. She became a touchstone. She didn't need to scream. The country did it for her, but it wasn't just viral, it was symbolic. In the end, it wasn't about a shouting match. It wasn't even about a single hearing. It was about what happens when power meets presence and loses. What played out in that oversight committee wasn't just politics. It was performance versus principle. Bluster versus backbone. It was a case study in how we respond when we're provoked, when we're gaslit, when we're dared to break and choose not to. Because Jasmine Crockett could have shouted back. She had every reason to. She had the mic. She had the momentum. She had the receipts, but she chose something else. She chose grace. And in doing so, she reminded us that composure doesn't mean weakness. That silence isn't surrender. That dignity, when held tight under fire, becomes its own kind of force. Her restraint wasn't passive. It was power. That hearing became more than a clip. It became a metaphor for every woman who's been talked over in a boardroom, for every black voice that's been told to lower the tone, for every truth-teller dismissed as too much the moment they start to speak clearly. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended the idea that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. In that moment, she stood for every teacher interrupted, every immigrant disrespected, Every young person silenced for daring to name injustice out loud. Her calm didn't just counter a chairman's anger, it exposed it. It revealed what happens when someone who is used to controlling the narrative suddenly finds themselves accountable to it. And the lesson rang loud. You don't have to match someone's volume to eclipse them. Because when you know who you are, when your words are backed by truth, and when your voice is rooted in service, not showmanship, you don't have to rise to the chaos. You just have to stand in your calm. Jasmine Crockett didn't win that moment because she went viral. She won it because she didn't flinch when the spotlight turned hostile. She didn't back down when the rules bent against her. She held her ground, flipped the page, and kept asking the questions. That wasn't strategy. That was character. And in a political world drowning in noise, her quiet clarity cut deeper than any headline. She reminded us that real power isn't in who talks over whom. It's in who keeps talking through the noise unshaken, unapologetic, and utterly undeterred. This wasn't just one woman defending herself. It was every person who's ever been told to stay quiet when they speak truth. And in the end, that's what echoed most. Not the shout, not the scandal, but the silence that followed the stillness that turned the tide, because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of shouting men is sit still and speak truth anyway, and that is how dignity wins. Stop talking. That was the moment the country leaned in. But what followed mattered more, not just for what it said about power, but for what it revealed about presence. This wasn't just a clash between two lawmakers. It was a mirror held up to the nation. A reminder that yelling doesn't make you right. That rage isn't the same as righteousness. And that the loudest person in the room is often the one with the least to say. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She modeled a new kind of leadership, one rooted in clarity, not chaos, in evidence, not ego. She proved that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't pound fists or raise voices. It flips the page. It cites the facts. It waits for the room to catch up. And when it does, it changes everything. So if you watched this moment and felt something pride, vindication, fire in your chest, know this. You're not alone. Because this was never just about a binder full of documents. It was about refusing to be silenced when the truth is on your side. And if you believe dignity should win over rage, share and subscribe. Let's amplify the calm voices who refuse to back down. Let's flood the conversation with poise, purpose, and power. Because in a world built on noise, grace is revolutionary. And sometimes the quietest voice is the one that echoes forever.